Okay. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the next edition of WorkReduce Live. We're going to be covering direct-to-consumer brands today. I'm joined by Chen and Michael Plater. Before we dive in, we'll wait for some participants to show up here and talk a little bit about the series. WorkReduce Live is our panel series we've been doing since pandemic started, and we converted our marketing budget from live events to online, and it's been a lot of fun. We've covered a range of topics and ranging from agency transformation to ad fraud and everything in between. And we're excited to talk about direct-to-consumer marketing today. So before I introduce our panelists, why are we talking about DTC? Well, last year, e-commerce grew enormously. We saw a 32% growth in e-commerce during 2020. A lot of that was pandemic fueled, and it's projected to grow another 20% this year. Yet, 85% of retail sales still happen offline. So where is it going? What are the drivers? What does this mean for big brands? What are the opportunities for DTC? And what does it mean for us as marketers? There's a lot to kind of dig into here. So in this exploding category, we're seeing a lot of investment activity. September showed Allbirds raising $100 million. We've seen M&A and IPO activity. The Harry's and Billy's acquisitions by Gillette and Schick were shut down by the SEC effectively. And the Casper IPO revealed a ton of really interesting data about the category, including some of the inefficiencies of it and the cost of things like returns. But for big brands, DTC is super interesting. It's a great way to get first-party data, which with both the rise of Amazon as an e-commerce channel and the potential impact of privacy and legislation and regulation and of changes in marketing attribution, that first party data is of increasing importance. So we see Heinz, Pepsi, Nike, Under Armour all going after this direct to consumer channel. And on the other side, we've got these DTC brands expanding into traditional channels, into brick and mortar. From a marketing perspective, you can't hop on the subway in New York sometimes without seeing a Casper ad. So they're looking at traditional marketing channels, and the streams are crossing. So we're going to dig into where this is going and why, in our panel today. So let me first introduce our panelists. We've got Chen, the CEO of Swidia, and Michael Plater, the director of marketing for the, I guess we'd call it a minimalist direct-to-consumer brand, Public Goods. Jack, why don't you kick it off? Tell us a little about what you're doing at Swidia, in particular with this direct-to-consumer and e-commerce segment.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the intro, Brian. Good to meet everybody. My name is Chen. We are a growth marketing and strategy firm where we partner with venture-funded consumer startups, both in like the tech space and the DTC space. And we'll also work with a lot of like larger brands that are trying to experience that same type of agility that you're talking about, Brian. And some of these best practices on like what we've learned in growth stages and how do we set things up so that they can have continued innovation and leadership in those categories, especially as these new waves of consumer behavior come out. So new products, new features, new audience groups, how do you tap into that efficiently? So that's kind of the bread and butter of what we do and what we love to do. Most of it's accomplished through elements of performance marketing, performance creative, go-to-market strategy for ideations and product validation. So ultimately, I think what's happening is, you're seeing this big shift in consumer behavior at its core, right? And everything really focuses around that consumer because they're ultimately making the decisions to either participate in your brand or not, right? And those are the kind of factors at a micro level that we need to look at. But at a macro level, there's a big fundamental shift in the way consumers are choosing to purchase brands, right? I think remote and quarantine has shown us that these signals are what we should be looking at, and that people are okay purchasing more online, staying at home, shifting their behavior to set up their own life in a way that's convenient for them. And as technology shifts, brands are noticing that they need to adapt their channels and way of engaging with the consumers in a way that's more efficient, right? So what are they doing at home now? Are they on the phone more? Are they watching TV more? And when they do shift outdoors, and when they start to experience either, out of home advertisements or event marketing again, or sorts of things that are more traditional in that threshold, how can we start to adapt some of those messages, right? And not just go full out immediately, right? But how do we start to incrementally understand, like, how is consumer behavior changing once we start to normalize back into society too? So it's a lot to talk about. I think post-COVID is really showing us that more and more we're going to need to future-proof our businesses in this day and age.
Amen. That's really good. And I want to come back to the shifts in consumer behavior, because I think that drives so much for marketing in general, right? And also, how to think about retail and e-commerce.
Mm-hmm.
So, Michael, over to you. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now with public goods, and also love to hear a little bit about your background, because you've done some pretty interesting stuff leading up to this as well.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks, Brian, and thank you for everyone who's joining. So I've been doing marketing for e-commerce companies for most of, if not all, my career. Everything from 4 people in a room with no product through acquisition to Fortune 1 at Walmart e-commerce and a bunch of places in between. And right now I'm at Public Goods, where we are trying to build that better everything store for the conscious consumer. So we have items across all categories, not focusing on a single category, but really trying to gain that trust and give peace of mind for all of our items with kind of a focus on sustainability and clean ingredients. So for me, what we're trying to focus on right now is saying, okay, if we live in this world of Amazon, and I say this often to the team, if we're living in a world of Amazon, what do we have to actually achieve to win, especially for us if we have this ambition of not just building a single category company, but competing against the best e-commerce companies out there and being that better Amazon for that conscious consumer. How do you end up doing that? And so at a high level, I like to say, you can't build a Nike with Facebook ads alone, but you can build it without Facebook ads. So like, what is that difference? What is that thing that we have to capture? Because the channels and what we're doing, consumer behavior, like we're talking about, will change. It will continue to change. We are in this moment right now, and by moment, I mean the last 15 years, where we've seen blue oceans of cheap inventory that have shot a number of companies up, whether it's back in MySpace and we got the rise of Match.com, or during the first days of Facebook and we get a movement watches that goes from 0 to $100 million in 5 years, just because the math made sense. You could arbitrage that. You could just put the dollars in and you didn't have to worry about too much else. And it was cheap inventory and cool, everything just worked. But in reality, we think of it in the last 15 years, it's most of a large part of our careers. But in reality, it's a short time period. It took Procter & Gamble 150 years to build $20 billion companies. And so when we're thinking about competing at the highest level, and if you're thinking about just competing in the world of Amazon in general, you just have to build something, and it sounds simple, but build something that people are willing to spend more for when there's the commodity version of it sitting right there that's easily to achieve and convenient. And so, that difference to me is that creating that strong resonance between not just the product you're building, but the idea and the opinion you're putting out there and the audience that you're trying to attract. And so whatever that idea and opinion, you have to end up being the steward of that idea and creating this really, really strong resonance between you and your audience. And that audience then decides they just want to be a part of the opinion you're putting out. And the way they do it is by buying the product. And they're willing to spend more for it. I use a lot of times an example of Chubbies. I think they do an amazing job of this, where they know exactly who their customer is. They know exactly how they're speaking to their customer. Their flagship product is a pair of shorts that you can buy on Amazon for half the price, but none of their customers do. They pay twice as much to be a part of Chubbies. And so for us at Public Goods is deciding what is that resonance, what is that opinion, what is that idea, how do we get it across to our consumers in the best way in the places they are, and how, regardless of how their behavior is changing. Nike's been around for a long period. They've gone through a lot of different consumer behavior changes, a lot of different channel changes, but that essence that is their brand is what's the sticky point, and that's what you have to achieve. And there's a lot of different ways and technical ways to think about it, and we can go into more of them. But in how Facebook fits into that, how Instagram fits into that, how all these other channels fit into that, there's places for all of them. But at the core, if you're trying to really build something lasting and something you're trying to achieve a high ambition for, that has to be at the core of whatever you're doing.
Let's start there with, that breaking out of Facebook and Instagram. So if we're starting with this idea of building something that's really meaningful to people, it seems like a lot of these brands are still starting with Facebook and Instagram. I'm seeing a lot of great, I find new clothes and shoes and whatever to buy on Instagram all the time. And I love what they're recommending to me. Really, really value it, right? So I guess, Jack, from your perspective, what are you seeing? Are people still starting there? Are the brands you're working with still starting a lot in Facebook and Instagram? And then at what point are they making that breakaway? And then how do they think about when to do it? And where do they go?
I think that's the fundamental question. And basically, with Facebook, the idea here is that it's still the king. I think in the digital perspective, you have all these things like iOS 14 and all these scary things that are coming through, right? And it's always been inevitable. But you do have brands that have always been built through Facebook, whether that's a Casper's or a Smile Direct Club, and these are the proofs that when you're able to leverage the data correctly to improve your growth, improve your customer acquisition, and feed that back into the business, you're able to create something that is sustainable in the long term. But it's not absolute, right? And so that's where all these multi-channel strategies need to come into place, right? And that's why they're not just staying there and they're going outdoors and trying other channels to make sure there's a continued lift. And so to your question about starting out of Facebook, I think that's still the best place to start out, merely because of the idea that, number one, they have the best data scientists in the world. Like, the data collection is, second to none. And when you're able to tap into that data, it doesn't mean that you're still not able to validate your product. It's still not able to kind of understand how scale fits into that and how the opportunity of scale could fit into that. And so Facebook, I think, from a cash flow, investment, and efficiency perspective, I still think Facebook's the best way to validate core ideas very quickly and very iteratively, for you to understand how you can start developing better messaging, better creative, and ultimately how you can use those insights to go on to other channels, right? So I always say that with this whole iOS 14 thing, it's not that consumer behavior has changed, right? And these are insights that I've gathered from other people as well. It's that Facebook's just cut the blinders, and they've put those on, and we just can't see it as clearly. But consumer behavior is still always going to be there. Now, the next question is, how do we start to leverage some of these insights, right? And then move out of there, which is your second part of the question, which is how do we break out of Facebook, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's so many incredible emerging channels that are coming, and things are happening so quickly. And that's why it's always about this idea of defensibility and making sure you're future-proofing your business by going on these emerging channels. What's the next one ring out if we're looking at it in concentric circles, right? And that's got to be TikTok, that's got to be Snapchat, and LinkedIn if you're a B2B company. But TikTok, it's got quite a large channel efficiency, and it's only going to get better and better in their ad platform. The barrier of entry to reap some of these benefits in customer acquisition ultimately is going to be the native elements of how you make your creative to fit that channel, right? And then two, how do you test that continuously? And so one granular way to do that is you look at what's happening on the organic side, right? You look at the signals on the organic side, whether that's you putting things out, whether that's other people. You look at what's discovering these winning ideas, and then you can drop those into paid ad campaigns. And that's a very cost-efficient way for smaller brands to really try that out. For larger brands, let's say they're going outdoors, let's say they want to try out some traditional threshold channels, using TikTok, using Facebook, using Snapchat as a way to validate core creative and core messaging across certain segment and groups. Once you have that down, you have much more confidence in dropping a lot more money into a billboard ad or a TV ad, right? Because you validated a lot of those core consumer messaging through iterative testing on these digital channels. And so once you're able to have that insight, you're able to leverage it much more confidently and effectively, I think, across these core channels. So kind of starting out from Facebook still as that core element to test things out, build your brand there. Don't be scared just because of iOS 14. You can be more cautious, but figure out ways to be creative with your assumption models and multiples, and develop ways to drive testing to outward rings of emerging channels and eventually to your broader traditional channels, but all coming through that core point of data and user insight.
Yeah. Well, so quick comment that came in, and everyone on who's watching, please feel free to send your comments in and your questions. We'll leave some time for questions at the end, but love to get your input. Comment from Anne Marie that she's surprised to hear that Snap is still considered an emerging channel. So, and I've got some perspective on that from the advertisers that we see and the agencies we work with. I think on a percentage of dollar spend basis, it is still relatively tiny, right? And that's probably why it's considered emerging. But Michael, for public goods, like how are you guys looking at these channels? Are you guys like lip syncing on TikTok? Like, what's like, is your consumer there? Or are you trying to go into, are you trying to reach people like my parents' age, right? And find them wherever they are. I don't know what they do online, but they're out there. So how are you thinking about these channels? And then what I'd love to get into is that how are you thinking about measuring the effectiveness of all the channels?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, lip syncing is about as good as I can do regardless. So otherwise I'd hire professionals. But we are testing into TikTok. We have a test going on right now through I think mid-May with a bunch of different buckets. It's kind of our first foray into TikTok. And Jack's definitely right. I mean, we and everyone else should be testing new channels because frankly, finding a blue ocean of arbitrageable inventory is a game changer. You should definitely be looking to find that everywhere you can. But beyond that of saying, okay, well, what do I really care about? What am I really controlling? I mean, it's that first party data, it's your email list, it's the actual content you're producing. I feel very strongly that you yourself and the brand has to become the influencer themselves. For whatever that opinion idea they're putting out. You can piggyback on other influencers. For us, we do a lot with micro influencers. We have a whole team that goes out and gifts, and we have a whole system related to that and growing that. That's a big thing for us at Public Goods, but you're still piggybacking on somebody else's influence, but ultimately you yourself and the brand has to become that influencer. And to me, that means content is king. Invariably, video is probably queen. Video is an amazing platform. We all know how powerful it is, and I think it's still undervalued. I'd much rather have a number of amazing video pieces on YouTube that aren't just being scrolled right by. They can still be searched on by the second largest search engine in the world, and they do a lot of value for us in that regard.
That's why we're producing some video content right now.
yeah, exactly.
To your point.
Exactly. But ultimately, still, it's what is the part that we're really caring about? And it is that first party data. You want over time your repeat customers and the percentage of that to grow above your new customers. And you want that to have a steady business and know that people are coming back, know you have great retention rates. And there's no way that happens without a great CRM system, without great email, and focusing on that and doing really well. And so when you get to the nuts and bolts of thinking, okay, well, how do I do email well? Well, it's a channel as well. You have to send something useful. And what better to send useful than the thing that makes you the authority in, again, whatever the idea is you're putting out there, and convincing your community and members of that. And so then you get to your question, right? Well, how do you actually measure these things, especially if you start doing billboards, or you start doing pop-ups, you start doing connected TV, all these different things? Well, that gets into your attribution system, and which is attribution is a deep, dark pit that every marketer at some point has to jump into. It's forced to jump into, and there's no perfect route. There's nothing perfect about it. But everything from, if you're spending, under 50K a month, you can get away with just analytics, especially if you're an e-commerce brand. You can get away with that and what's on Shopify. How important is referral program to DTC? Referral is an interesting one. Referral is amazing because, I mean, there's nothing better than your community bringing in people that they think is like your community. Typically, that's anywhere from 2 to 5% of your new customers. If you really do something amazing, maybe you can get it higher, in which case you should definitely do that. It takes a lot of work to get it much higher than that. A lot of times, as far as value in and value out, you may focus on other things. But if you're not at that, 5%, especially again, depending on how important the idea is you're putting out there. If again, if there's a lot of ways where you could be focused more on a more transactional business, in which case you're not as worried about that and you don't have to have such a high referral rate. And there's plenty of great businesses that are like that out there. But if you're focused more on brand building, then yeah, you want a higher referral rate. You want it closer to 5, perhaps even beyond, and spending the time on that. For the attribution, if you're spending under 50K, you can get away with just using analytics. Maybe you use something like Little Data to make sure the data is even better. But
how about just Excel? Can you get it done in Excel?
I sure hope not. That's Excel hell to me. But
Okay.
Outside of that, once you start spending above that threshold and you're spending, especially across other channels, and especially if you get to like spending over 300K a month or so, then you probably, definitely need to look at other solutions. There's other ones out of the box that I would say, depending on what your ambitions are, if you're 300K a month and doing well and you're not trying to become the next Amazon or something, then you can use something out of the box like Rockerbox, or there's some other ones out there. But if you are trying to shoot for the moon, probably the best solution is you got to roll your own, and which is tough. There's a lot
That's
of moving
scary,
parts.
man. That's just frightening to me. Just as
Yeah.
a former software engineer, there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, that's for sure. I've been implementing attribution systems since 2011, and it's only gotten slightly easier. But there are some certain parts that are easier to plug and play. How you're pulling in your event pipeline, whether you're using something like Segment or Snowplow or Heap or Mixpanel, all those work. You're pulling in your cost data, whether it's through Stitch or something like that. We use Stitch ourselves. All that goes into your database, Redshift, or whatever else you're using, and you have some transformation tool, DBT, something like that on top of it, and then it goes into your BI. And then it's a matter of saying what's the algorithm that's actually determining the value. Right now, a lot of people use just last click, first click, basically a one-click system, which again, if you're doing all this, you're not doing all this to still use a one-click system. You're going to go to a multi-touch attribution system, whether it's 40-20-40, or again, this is where it becomes kind of black magic.
That's the art part. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no perfect system. You can throw time decays in there. There's all types of stuff you can do with that. But at that point, now at least it's better than not doing that. And you can capture value that you weren't capturing before. So if you have anywhere some type of touch point, whether it's a pop-up and you get an email from someone there, or just your normal attributing correct value to clicks from any type of news system, whether it's TikTok, where maybe they don't have the perfect ad system baked in there, but you can see visits and thus start to attribute better value to it than having to use some one-click system. It just allows you to have a bit more flexibility. And yeah, that's really the only, if you're aiming high, that's really, in my opinion, the only way to do it. But again, if you're not, save yourself the headache and go for simplicity.
Well, so Jack, what are you seeing in terms of how you're looking across a broader client base? I think, how are they looking at understanding what's working and what's not?
I think in terms of like technology and attribution in general. I think, and I'll just go everything that Michael said, plus basically this idea that you need to make sure you're having the right assumption models in place. You need to make sure you're doing the right testing models in place. And so you'll be using things like you said, like Kachava, like Segment, Amplitude, if you're a tech company, an app company, but how do you understand some of the behaviors within those products and then backwards feed into the marketing strategy to continue that loop back in, right? And so especially, and I keep going back to iOS 14, I know that's the scary monster in the room, but whenever you say attribution, for some reason, everybody's always thinking about iOS 14, but that's kind of the obstacle that we all have to get over. Ultimately, it's going to be really difficult to set up something custom and internal. You're going to need a lot of resources. And like you guys said, it's a very scary big beast, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about having a multi-channel strategy, right? Like the core measurement of things and over-optimization and the media and the tracking, it's going to get more and more difficult over time, especially with cookies being gone, especially with some of these event tracking being gone. And so that kind of leads into something where I'm a firm believer in, which is like performance creative, right? And like, how do you put more effort now on the creative and the messaging to use that as a form of validation to measure certain success points within your products. But yeah.
Well, so, and then a question's coming in from Stephanie. Do normal funnel metrics apply for DTC campaigns? I know Stephanie's more of a pharma marketer from her background, right? Or are you always looking at, like, how are you looking at that funnel? What are the metrics? How are you thinking about brand awareness, right, versus the actual conversions? Or is it always just, hey, we got to get these conversions done because we got to meet our numbers? Or can you step back and think about how the brand sentiment and stuff like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in that. In an ideal world, you can focus on all of these, what I like to call social value-based channels, whether it's referrals, whether it's great content, press. I'd much rather someone hear about us and join us from an amazing press article than some 1200 by
Totally.
628 Facebook ad. And the problem is, if I could reach all of my goals, our monthly, quarterly goals, and hit those with just these social value-based channels, I would do that. Problem is, almost certainly that's just not the case. And because there's high goals, we have high ambitions, we have things we want to do and numbers we have to hit. And so that delta, that is the spend. That is spending on Facebook, on Instagram, on Google. That is all of that. So in an ideal world, I honestly would not love to never do that. I would meet all my goals with just these social value-based channels. It's much better for the brand. I think those customers are much better for us regardless. And it creates leverage in the business. I don't have to spend my contribution margin for every new person who's never heard of us before. All types of reasons. But we have goals and we have metrics and we have growth that we are trying to hit. And so that delta is made up with and in the focus on conversions. Other parts of the funnel, I think it's very business dependent. So, whether, like, for us, we have a trial, so we care a lot about the trial sign up versus just the purchase.
Gotcha.
Other companies I know, for example, BarkBox, 50% of their revenue came from their email signups. So they were probably very focused on email and just in capturing and having actual value for getting an email itself. If you have that funnel really dialed in, so it depends on the business. But yeah, that delta almost begets and requires that you're super focused on conversion to hit those numbers.
Going back to the attribution question, or sorry, go ahead, Jack. But I want to ask you about cohorts. So if you're thinking about Flock and some of that stuff, but yeah, pick up on the upper funnel stuff if you can.
I was just going to mention that I think a lot of the focus these days is probably going to start shifting more towards the middle and bottom funnel, especially more towards the product, because as you look at the type of competition and less arbitrage in driving attention and getting people to come into the top funnel, ultimately, and Michael, you might be seeing this too across your brands, it's really about this idea of retention, right? Like, how do you continue to retain customers? And that's going to ultimately fuel a lot of the acquisition at the top funnel and also continue to monetize your brand at the bottom funnel. And so when we start to monetize and acquire new customers, we just need to make sure that the right retention model is in place. And so that could be like a second time purchase. It could be your churn rates. It could be how long someone is on your subscription, right? And what are the core things that you can have in terms of touch points with your existing customer base to drive them to have, and I mentioning previous comment, like more referrals into the DTC realm, right? How do you get more people to come in based on some of the experiences that you're having, right? And you start to create some viral loops in that sense. So going back to your customer's experience with the product and driving more resources towards how do you retain them longer term is, I think, is going to ultimately help a lot of those upper funnel metrics ultimately, than dumping all of your money to try and optimize for trial and purchase and add to carts. Because what's going to happen is your lifetime value is going to suffer and your average order value might suffer as well. So when you develop these right loops in the referral space, whether that's like price savings or free product giveaways, like membership points, expanding your product to different products, that's, I think, ultimately going to be a big player in helping a lot of DTC brands, especially outside of Facebook, going back to that original topic. But didn't mean to deter.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is something I tell the team all the time, like, think of the site as our engine, and we have to make sure that engine is humming perfectly before you start throwing lots of gas and doing TV and billboards. It doesn't get more upper funnel than that. And so, like when I joined Public Goods, we were doing connected TV, and I paused that for us because
Yeah.
I felt like we had a lot of things with the engine, some fundamentals that we needed to shore up, and we'll go back to that. We have big plans for TV and beyond, and a bunch of other things. But you have to make sure that your engine is tuned up and everything's going and running the right way. You have all your trigger emails, you have all your referral loops, you have all your loyalty programs working, you have just all these things, your recommendation engine, all those flow, everything has to be really good before you decide, oh, I'm just going to pour the top of the mountain gas on it.
Right.
At least that's always been my opinion.
Because
And
you
the
potentially
thing,
you're just wasting the money otherwise, because you're not capturing everything that's coming through generated by these upper funnel programs.
And it's going to be harder to
yeah,
do that as well. Yeah.
yeah. And the only thing that pushes back against that is speed. Obviously we want to grow faster. So
Yeah. So interesting. I always come back to, a friend of mine worked for a while at DraftKings, right? And they made this transition into spending massive amounts of TV dollars, right? And I guess they must have had a pretty efficient, conversion engine, because they poured more money into TV than anybody else, pretty much. And it seemed like it worked. Like I could see Public Goods doing really well on television, on traditional broadcast.
yeah, I mean, our video creative is our best creative. I mean, I have
Mm,
no doubt as a brand that we will achieve every ambition that we have.
yeah.
I wouldn't have joined if I didn't think otherwise. So yeah, I fully agree.
Jack, do you guys ever look at television?
Mainly CTV and like OTT, and those are more things that are going to drive that awareness, drive that like maybe longer term retention. But I think a lot of the budget and focus is still more so around this idea of performance channels that are a bit more measurable. But you cannot forget about these CTVs or OTT programs, because that's such a core part of the consumer behavior now. Like going back to like remote, it's think about, just look at your daily like activity in the past like 6 months to a year. Like think of how many more times you've opened up Hulu, like Netflix and AMC. Like it's and that's not going to go away anytime soon, right? And some places are remote permanently, and so that's that ultimate shift to go future proof. Is like, now that we can't say like TV it's not effective just because it's TV and you can't measure it as well. You're still going to need to implement some of that into your holistic strategy, and that's definitely an aspect that we want to continue building into as well.
Yeah, and you'll see.
So I want to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add one last thing, and I mean, TV is also important from the fact that when you're running it, you'll also see your Facebook ads will perform better.
That's right.
And all of that's connected, and so how do you capture that value as well? So, yeah.
So, audience question again from Anne Marie, and thank you for this one, Anne Marie. She says, my client audience are Gen X and Boomers. They're not as active on TikTok, Snap, etc. What other channels should I be looking at for effective DTC engagement? Great question. And that's something I always kind of wonder as well.
Yeah, I think we always forget about direct mail. Like it can work. It can have a high upfront cost. So a lot of people don't think about it. And it's just, again, if you're looking at the last 15 years and everyone in the business, it's just not something we think of as a modern channel. But
it's the original, kind of like data-driven channel, right?
Yeah.
Data channel, right?
I've seen it work in the past. We are just starting to test some things out at Public Goods as well. It can work. It has some high upfront costs. It can, so it's not for your first channel you're going to do probably. But it can work, and it will work well, especially in the beginning, where it can really I think of it as a cost thing. One of the biggest mistakes I find is people will want to send this amazing magazine to every possible.
That costs $2 a pop, right?
Oh, there's no way it's going to work. There's no way that's going to work. And so like send the 40-cent 6x9. Try that, and then go from there. But yeah.
I did some work a while back with a company called Pebble Post, right? And they've got they're one of several players doing programmatic direct mail, where you can have e-commerce triggers into postcards. And the price point there is pretty high, right? It's probably $1 a pop, but the conversion rates that they were seeing when I was working with them were pretty phenomenal. So, and follow up from Anne-Marie, is the objective to direct mail still to push the receiver online? I'd say yes in most of these cases. What do you guys think?
Yeah, Agreed.
It's all online, right?
Yeah, get them online. I mean, unless we have, and that's probably just the circumstance of the businesses we're in. If we had, hundreds of stores across the country, there'd probably be a different way we could think about it. But for us, yeah, getting them online.
Yeah, I mean, even for Gen X and baby boomers, like email marketing is so huge, and I think that's a channel that they're still very, very familiar with. And the I think the fear of it is like, once baby boomers and Gen X are like the quote unquote like laggers, right? And so like they're, once a platform is saturated, most of the time like Gen X and baby boomers have gone on it, and then like you'll have like Gen Z and Gen Pop kind of go into like other newer channels that don't have as much economics to purchase products, right? But I would say like email is still something that has stood the test of time, especially at a point where you're able to acquire customers not for free, but like if you own that list, that's an engine that you churn over and over and over again, right? And then combining that with different types of activations like referrals, right, and different platforms. There's a great platform, and I'm not affiliated with them in any type of way, but coopcommerce.com. Basically, it's a post-purchase experience. And I think a lot of baby boomers, they have loyalty to the brands and products that they purchase from, whether it's DTC or not. And so what this platform can do is, after you purchase something on the website, immediately it'll give you some suggestions of other brands that they can cross-sell you to. And these are not direct competitors. These are other brands that might share the same user groups and customers that your brand has, right? And so instead of fighting for the same customer, all these brands are working together and saying, hey, we'll share that experience with you guys as well, so long as you're not a direct competitor in a co-op way. So like very creative ways of doing that, and understanding like how is the consumer behavior for Gen X and baby boomers like slowly evolving and over time, and how are they experiencing digital? It's definitely one of the critical questions, but I think email and referrals and Facebook events too. I still think it's undervalued for those cohorts.
Yeah, and
that makes a lot of sense.
Co-op works. It definitely works. You just have to be willing to put other brands in your checkout flow, even if they're not competitors. So it's more of like a product decision, if anything. But yeah, it does work. And just to harp on the email piece, I mean, to me, email is still your most important channel, especially now, and not just from having repeat customers, but with iOS 14, all these other pieces, having that first party, not relying on cookies, so that you can use the conversion API, you can use similar things with other channels that you have. Like that is, for so many different reasons, that continues to be important. Creating custom audiences, creating lookalikes often. I mean, for so many different reasons, not just the repeat customer piece, but if you got to keep building that up and expanding the other kind of first party channels, whether it's SMS or anything like that. But yeah.
So with that, speaking of Gen X and boomers, right? These are folks who we associate more traditionally with legacy retailers, brick and mortar. But we're seeing those brands, like those traditional brands and e-commerce players, they're trying to get into this D2C space, right? What are you guys seeing that these traditional players are taking out of the DTC experience that they can or should be using?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen, excuse me, for example, Adidas, they have the goal of being about 50% D2C by 2025, and they've gone from single digits up to 20-something% over the last 5 years. So even large brands like that understand moving towards a more D2C model, and starting to think about their inventory in a portfolio way, where you have certain types of items, maybe your flagship items are ones that you control the most, and then you have your own owned stores that maybe has a certain slightly different style or collection there, and then you still have wholesale. Wholesale makes up a good portion of a lot of these brands, but you think about them differently, and how and the types of inventory you're sending there. So you're starting to have this portfolio effect with the inventory, especially when you start thinking about the D2C part being that core part, and how you have that ownership with the community and with the audience. And if that's where you're creating that connection and putting out that idea, then the items and inventory that represent that is a little bit different than if you're giving it out to a wholesale retailer and the types of inventory you're putting there.
So it's basically, you're talking about effectively a kind of channel product matrix and adjusting that to get into more the DTC channels.
Yeah, and incentivizing those customers, like for them to get what is the most core products to your company and your brand, come to the company and brand and know them for that.
Right. It's also
And
helping you defend against Amazon, right?
yeah,
If that's one of your concerns.
yeah.
Right.
Again, we live in an Amazon world right now, and you got to work around it, figure it out.
Yeah. Jack, what are you seeing? You're doing work with traditional brands who are
Yeah.
actually trying to do this. Like, what are they up to? Like, how do they look at this?
Yeah, I'll give you the scoop in the best way possible, or in as much as I can give. But we're working with a larger brand in the Fortune 100, the 500, and basically their whole thing is like it's first party data, right? And it's making sure that they can understand how to leverage and use that to go back into their own R&D and produce products that can understand the consumers better and also kind of push their brand forward. I think what happens is, you have a lot of, especially like CPG companies, first party data is usually owned by the suppliers or the retailers, right?
Retailers, yeah.
Yeah, and then they're not going to give it back to you. And so I'm a big brand, and I'm saying, well, hey guys, like how do we develop, like what do our customers want? And they say, oh, here's this thought leadership paper and all these things, but like they don't know, right? They don't know. And so that's why I think like first party data, and to Michael's points, doing these activations and specific channel activations to make sure you're driving the consumers and meeting the consumers on the right channels for your products. But also, most importantly, like understanding how to acquire first party data efficiently and effectively, especially because they're coming into the game when Facebook's like, hey, we're going to be less efficient. And so whether that's new products, new campaigns, brands coming in. And so for the company that we're working with right now, their whole thing is like, we're going to have these 5 different verticals, and we're going to drive innovation in these 5 different verticals by just developing startups within them. They're moving towards a shift in terms of like, how do we start thinking like a tech startup in driving agility and innovation ideas quickly, disproving them quickly. And then once we have a key idea, let's pull resources into it and drive that initiative to acquire more insights, more first party data, more better experiences, which is going to ultimately feed insights and development for the larger brand and the company brand. So I think on their end, it's about not following, they have to lead. And by doing that, they're not going to be lagging behind all these challenger brands that are effectively taking away some of their core customers, right? Right. They just might purchase them, right? Having a strong acquisition strategy of purchasing, DTC competitors is always going to be up there, right? And that's also going to feed into your R&D and drive more first party data, opens up a new category of customers. So that's kind of what we're seeing in that realm. And it's quite interesting seeing the convergence of how growth startups and tech startups are driving innovation and testing and validation, and moving those models into a more kind of traditional brand model where they can just quickly innovate ideas and create these innovation hubs, it's not a new concept, but we're seeing it more and more. Especially
there's more urgency around it right now, right?
100%.
These little guys are nipping at the heels. So yeah. I mean, Michael, imagine you think about like Clorox, right? They just came off of a year where they're like a case study in brand equity, but they're still just selling bleach at the end of the day, right? Like, what would you do, if you were, in your role at Clorox to, be more engaged and put some of the ideas that Jack's talking about in play?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's funny. There's speaking of pop-ups, and for something like this, I mean, like Clorox isn't sitting there trying to figure out this perfect equation to get the right exact CAC, and like at this point, they are sitting there saying, how do we make sure people think of us as a brand top of mind when they want to clean clothes? And like, what is that idea? How do we inject ourselves and have that insight into the consumer, figure out what is the need, how do we create a marketing message around that insight, and make it large light in whatever the way and channel is necessary for that. And thinking of it much more broad. Emotional connection is one way of calling it, but that process of problem, insight, crafting a message, building a campaign around it, that's the whole kind of much more traditional brand marketer feedback loop. And for those at Clorox and CPG companies, they're true brand marketers. That's how they're trained. And so whether it's a pop-up, sure. I mean, I had a friend who was doing a startup in kind of business space, business clothing space, and they did a pop-up where nothing to do with the clothing, but they just did free professional photos for headshots. You come in,
Cool.
you give us your email, and they do give you a free professional photo headshot, and it worked great for them. I mean, it's this kind of thing that is not necessarily tied directly to, they're not selling anything there, but it's their customer and they're giving something of real value, and it worked for them as far as building that email list. And so similar for pop-ups or any type of thing you're thinking about, it's like, what is a need, or what is the need for your particular community, and how can you find the insight in that? How do you create a message and a campaign around that? And again, ideally, that cycle again is what I would love for all of my time in marketing to be spent on. but we have goals, and we have goals to hit, and so it's not. But and that's perfectly fine. I mean, we have it's the tools that we have, and to not use them would be dumb. And so we take the things that we need and we use them to our advantage, and we find where we can do better with everything out there. But still, at the very core of it, it goes back to my first statement of, you can build Nike without Facebook ads, but you can't build it with just Facebook ads. And so, what is that thing, and how do you achieve it?
Right on. So getting, I think, towards the end here, want to see if there's any last kind of questions from our panel audience. So get those in there if not, if you've got any. And otherwise, love to get some kind of final thoughts from you guys. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. So Jack, anything to close with?
I think, whether you're a small business, whether you're an ad tech, company, or whether you're a big brand trying to figure things out, ultimately everything is going to drive around the core audience experience, right? The core user experience. And that's just more of an embedded philosophy on my end. And I think the more you understand how consumer behavior is shifting with macro adjustments, new channels, and all these new things that are happening so quickly, the better we're able to kind of future-proof our business. And that's the ultimate core idea, is like future-proofing and being a couple steps ahead, or at least adapting quickly when stuff hits the fan. And I think one kind of caveat that I would say, and to leave with you guys, is I think, performance creative, like using this idea of performance creative as a way to leverage your business, test things out, drive conversion. And there's so many use cases for it. I would say, like, not to shy away from that if you haven't tried it. It's okay if it's scrappy. It's okay if it doesn't fit your brand guidelines, right? Like, your new customers and core audiences may adjust their desirability towards your brand guidelines, right? And so there's a lot of different ways that you can start testing that, right? We've entered this new age, and so we have to adapt to it, right? You've had your media automation era with programmatic. You've had your hyper targeting with Facebook. We have now, it's kind of shifting towards like performance creative, and I think that's going to be a big shift. If you're going to put any kind of attention towards anything, it's definitely that as like more of a methodical and tactical approach.
Yeah, the performance creative one is so interesting and awesome, and we're going through the same process as well. And I've talked to other production companies that are dealing with clients who their minimum is well above even the spend we're doing, and they're in a place where they'll produce 30 videos a month, and trying to find just one that is a hero, put all the dollars in that hero, that it lives for a month or two, and then rinse and repeat. And that's just the process. So
that's a lot. It sounds like a lot of work.
It's a lot of money. That's what it is.
It's becoming a standard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, everything we've talked about, my biggest takeaway is that, all of this, it's hard. All of this is just hard, but
it's work.
That is,
gotta do the work.
That's the game we're in. That's what we're playing. And if it was easy, we honestly probably still wouldn't even be here. Then we'd be somewhere else. I mean, the struggle is one that I enjoy doing, and you probably should if you're going deep in it. But there's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts, and those parts are changing all the time, and it's just hard. So embrace that, steel your mind, and get to it.
Love it. All right, that's a great mindset to end on. Thank you both for joining us, and thanks everybody in the audience. We'll have this up on YouTube in no time for the laggards, and hope to see all of you guys in the audience on our next panel. Jack,
Awesome.
Michael, thanks again. It was really fun. I super enjoyed the conversation.
Pleasure. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.